At 9:17 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappear into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor. Genda was the principal architect of the attack plan. He had spent 11 months refining every detail, calculating every variable, preparing for every contingency. He knew the American fleet strength down to individual destroyers. He knew their aircraft inventory. He knew their defensive capabilities. He had studied reconnaissance photographs until he could draw the layout of Pearl Harbor from memory. But there was one number, gender, and the entire Japanese naval intelligence apparatus had catastrophically wrong. A number that would determine the outcome of the war before a single shot was fired. The Japanese High Command estimated that by December 1943, the United States Navy would have 1,370 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The actual strength on that date was 219,279 officers, 124,72 officer candidates, and 234,343 enlisted personnel. They assumed the Americans did the same. They were wrong. The Imperial Japanese Navy calculated that the ships Yoshikawa reported represented roughly 30,000 men. In reality, the U.S. Pacific Fleet required more than 220,000 to operate and support those vessels. The difference was not a clerical error. It was a conceptual one. Japanese planners could not imagine an industrial power that built its ships for comfort, redundancy, and repair, not for austerity. They did not understand a navy designed to fight half a world away and to bring every man back alive if possible. When Tokyo planned its war, it did so believing it faced an enemy 1/7 its actual strength. Every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel, every calculation of risk flowed from that false premise. And by the time the truth became visible, when American carriers returned again and again, when fresh ships appeared faster than Japan could sink them, the correction came too late. Japanese naval intelligence officers in Tokyo had access to extensive information about American naval practices. They received attaché reports from officers stationed in Washington and other American cities. They monitored technical publications detailing American shipbuilding programs. They analyzed captured documents and interviewed merchant sailors who had visited U.S. ports. The raw data existed, but having information is not the same as understanding it. The Imperial Navy's intelligence apparatus suffered from fundamental organizational weaknesses that prevented accurate analysis. Intelligence was considered a secondary function, useful but subordinate to operations and command. Reports that contradicted existing assumptions were often ignored or quietly buried. Few officers sought intelligence assignments. They were seen as career dead ends, offering little chance for promotion or prestige compared to combat commands. The result was an institution that prized action over comprehension, momentum over accuracy. Captain Toshikazu Ohmae, an officer in the operations section of the Naval General Staff, was responsible for long-range planning. He was one of the few who understood the scale of what Japan faced. Ohmae had studied American naval doctrine and industrial capacity for years. He warned that the United States could replace losses far faster than Japan could destroy them, and that American manpower and shipbuilding potential dwarfed Japan's own. His estimates were dismissed as pessimistic. "If we fight as we train," one senior admiral told him, "the war will be over in 6 months." Ohmae knew better. His numbers said otherwise. But numbers could not compete with faith. Faith in training, in spirit, in the idea that courage could compensate for steel. And when the plans for the Pearl Harbor strike were finalized, they rested not on the intelligence that existed, but on the intelligence the High Command wanted to believe. The calculations were methodical and detailed. Planners examined American naval construction programs and ship delivery schedules, analyzed training pipelines and personnel development systems, and studied logistics and supply infrastructure. But their personnel projections assumed American mobilization would mirror Japan's own. Elite crews, compact manpower rosters, and little use of large reserve forces. Under that model, Tokyo concluded the U.S. could sustain only some 40 major combatants in the Pacific, and would be hard-pressed to conduct simultaneous operations across multiple theaters. That estimate was folded into war plans at the highest levels. The strategy that followed: seize resource areas across Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, and force a negotiated settlement. All rested on the idea of fighting a constrained, numerically limited opponent who might eventually accept compromise. In short, seize what you can, then hold it until the other side tires. They were preparing for the wrong war. Why did experienced, intelligent officers repeat the same error? The answer is mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is the shorthand habit of assuming the enemy thinks, organizes, and values things the way you do. Looking through a Japanese lens, American practices appeared familiar. A premium on professional crews, tightly run ships, and high standards of performance. Because the Imperial Navy's own system did not rely heavily on reservists, planners projected similar limits onto the U.S. system. What they missed was scale, and the institutional differences that made scale possible. The United States did not organize its Navy as a small, professional elite meant to last a lifetime. It had a vast industrial base, a political culture comfortable with mass mobilization, and administrative systems for rapid expansion. Large peacetime training establishments that could be converted into wartime boot camps, civilian shipyards that could churn out hulls by the dozens, and bureaucracies that could accelerate officer and enlisted accession when required. Those were not minor differences of degree. They were differences of kind. Where Japan saw an opponent constrained by doctrine and habit, the United States could, and would, substitute numbers, industrial throughput, and logistical depth for what Japan prized as qualitative superiority. Because mirror imaging corrupted judgment at the analytical level, it infected operational planning. Goals set for the Pearl Harbor strike and for follow-on operations implicitly assumed American manpower and replacement capacity would lag. They were meant to be crippling enough to force the United States to sue for peace, or, at least, to slow U.S. recovery long enough for Japan to consolidate gains. When the enemy did not behave as expected, when shipyards replaced lost tonnage, when training centers accelerated throughput, and when American carriers and crews returned to the fight, Japanese plans had no built-in hedge. There was no contingency for protracted attrition a Tokyo could not match. This was not just a statistical error. It was a strategic one. Mirror imaging turned available intelligence into a blinder. Data existed, but the analytic frameworks, institutional incentives, and cultural priors turned those data into the story commanders wanted to hear, rather than the one they needed to act on. And when the first blows were struck, the consequence was not merely tactical surprise but a strategic miscalculation, whose costs Japan would only learn as the war unfolded. They did not conduct mass recruiting campaigns. They did not believe civilians could be transformed into sailors in a matter of months. Their entire cultural and institutional framework emphasized the slow, deliberate development of professional personnel through years of service. Japan's peacetime navy of roughly 120,000 men expanded to only 300,000 by the end of the war, a threefold increase over 4 years. By Japanese standards, that was rapid. They assumed the American approach would be similar. They assumed building a navy required the same careful, methodical process that Japan followed. In doing so, they projected their own limitations onto an enemy with entirely different capabilities and a fundamentally different concept of national mobilization. The reality of American expansion was something Japanese intelligence had no context to imagine. In June 1941, the United States Navy numbered approximately 284,000 active personnel, officers, enlisted men, nurses, and support staff worldwide. 18 months later, in December 1942, that figure had grown to 1,640,000. By December 1943, it reached 2,374,094. The growth was not linear, it was exponential. As training facilities multiplied, throughput accelerated, recruitment intensified, the entire American industrial and social system pivoted toward total war. Japanese intelligence officers were not ignorant of American capacity. They studied shipbuilding statistics, monitored U.S. naval construction in trade journals, and knew that America could produce hulls faster than Japan. What they failed to understand was that the United States could simultaneously man those hulls, that its educational infrastructure, bureaucratic systems, and industrial scale allowed for the rapid transformation of civilians into competent sailors, aviators, and technicians on a scale no other nation could match. Tokyo's planners had built a strategy calibrated to fight a mirror image of themselves. Instead, they found themselves facing a mobilization machine, a nation capable of replacing losses faster than Japan could count them. The difference was not merely quantitative, it was existential. The United States was not constrained by manpower. In 1941, the country had 131 million people. Roughly 50 million were men of military age. Even accounting for agricultural deferments to maintain food production, industrial exemptions to keep factories running, and medical disqualifications, the pool of potential recruits remained effectively limitless. By contrast, the Imperial Japanese Navy drew from a population of 73 million, half that of the United States, and from a far narrower segment of society. Women were almost entirely excluded from naval service. Social hierarchies and class distinctions restricted recruitment. Educational standards were high and rigidly enforced. The mathematics of the situation should have been obvious. A nation twice the size, with fewer social barriers and a broader conception of service, could mobilize on a scale Japan could never match. But intelligence analysis is not about what should be obvious. It is about what analysts are prepared to see. And Japanese analysts were not prepared to imagine an enemy capable of expanding its navy tenfold in less than 4 years. The first hints that something was wrong came in May 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported an American task force centered on 2 carriers. By Japanese standards, that meant roughly 4,000 sailors in the immediate operational area. Yet radio intercepts told a different story. Cryptographers monitoring U.S. signals detected references to multiple task group commanders, to extensive logistics ships conducting underway replenishment, and to screening forces far larger than expected for a 2-carrier formation. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggerations or errors in translation. They could not be reconciled with existing assumptions. How could the Americans, supposedly short on trained crews, field such a complex and well-supported force so early in the war? The possibility that U.S. mobilization had already outpaced Japanese estimates was unthinkable. But in the months that followed, at Midway, in the Solomons, and across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the unthinkable became undeniable. Every new encounter revealed not a dwindling adversary, but one that was growing stronger, faster, and more organized with each passing battle. The after-action estimate put American personnel in the Coral Sea operational area at 7,000 to 9,000 for 2 carriers, nearly double the manning levels. Japanese planners had assumed. The figure was noted and then minimized. Task force commanders, the naval staff reasoned, often ran bloated organizations. Perhaps the Americans were inefficient, or bunched inexperienced sailors into larger complements to make up for inexperience. The warning sign was filed away. The second, and far more damning, indication arrived at Midway. The tactical outcome was catastrophic for Japan. 4 fleet carriers lost, more than 3,000 men killed, and the irreplaceable pool of veteran pilots and maintenance crews shattered. Yet what stunned Japanese intelligence was not only the loss, but what the Americans didn't lose. Yorktown should have gone under. According to Japanese assumptions about carrier vulnerability, about how quickly fires, flooding, and system failures fatally cascaded, she ought to have been a burning hulk within hours. Instead, Yorktown kept fighting. Hit repeatedly on June 4th, Yorktown was dead in the water by mid-afternoon, her flight deck and power systems devastated. But within a matter of hours, American damage control parties had stabilized flooding, isolated fires, improvised patches, and restored enough power and seaworthiness to get the ship steaming again, and to resume flight operations later that day. Where Japanese doctrine relied on small, highly skilled specialist teams and minimal redundancy, the U.S. approach baked resilience into every level. Larger crews with cross-training, redundant systems, abundant pipe fittings and repair materials, pre-positioned spare parts, and a doctrine that empowered enlisted damage control squads to improvise relentlessly. For Japanese analysts, the lesson cut 2 ways. First, the United States was not merely manning more ships. It was organizing each ship to survive in a manner Japan had not anticipated. Larger crews and simpler. Redundant arrangements meant a ship could sustain, damage and keep operating long enough for repairs or to withdraw for dockyard work, converting what the IJN assumed would be a one-way kill into a temporary setback. Second, Yorktown's recovery pointed to a shoreside and industrial ecosystem capable of rapid repair. Floating dry docks, merchant and auxiliary repair vessels, and sprawling naval yards that could refit and return capital ships far faster than Tokyo expected. The cumulative effect was brutal. Japan's attrition plan, designed to inflict blows so severe that American industrial and manning limits would force negotiation, relied on assumptions about permanence that proved false. Damage control and repair turned many tactical defeats into recoverable losses for the Americans. Mass mobilization turned recoverable losses into replaced ships and new crews. Tokyo's failure was not only to underestimate production and recruitment, but to miss that the U.S. had engineered resilience into fleet operations. By the summer of 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Where Japanese planners had hoped attrition would degrade American capacity, it instead revealed a system that absorbed and then amplified wartime pressure. The strategic consequence was stark. Japan was tied to a timetable it could not meet. committed to hold territory against an enemy that could pay the demographic and industrial costs of a long war. The realization came too late to change the underlying strategy. It only explained why Japan's window of strategic opportunity closed far sooner than Tokyo had ever imagined. The Americans seemed to have entire platoons of damage control personnel on a single vessel, with secondary teams ready to take over if the first were incapacitated. Where did all those people come from? A Japanese fleet carrier operated with roughly 1,500 crew. Intelligence estimates suggested American carriers had similar manning, perhaps slightly higher. But the Yorktown's crew list, recovered from papers found floating after the battle, contained more than 2,200 names. The Americans were carrying nearly 50% more personnel than Japanese planners had assumed. That meant 50% more damage control capacity, 50% more maintenance strength, 50% more sustained operational endurance, 50% more everything. The implications were enormous. More crew meant more resilience. More resilience meant ships that could survive hits, repair themselves at sea, and return to battle far faster than Japanese doctrine considered possible. Yet Tokyo headquarters did not adjust its fundamental assumptions about American naval strength. The data were uncomfortable. Therefore, they were dismissed. The third warning came in August 1942, during the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major American offensive of the war. Japanese planners had expected the U.S. to be constrained by manpower. Their estimates projected perhaps 2 or 3 reinforced battalions, 8 to 10,000 troops at most, for an initial landing. The reality stunned them. 11,000 Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal alone, with additional forces landing on nearby Tulagi and smaller islands. In total, more than 16,000 American personnel participated in the opening phase of the operation. The naval forces supporting the landings were even more revealing. 3 aircraft carriers, a battleship, 14 cruisers, and 31 destroyers. Operating that fleet required over 30,000 sailors, not counting the merchant marine crews running the transports and supply ships. Japanese intelligence officers reviewing intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance reports realized that the Americans had deployed a task force larger and more complex than anything Japan had ever attempted. This was not the behavior of a nation fighting with limited manpower. It was the manifestation of a mobilization machine in motion, an enemy capable of projecting power across oceans with layers of logistical depth. And yet, even as reports filtered back to Tokyo, the institutional inertia of the Imperial Navy prevailed. Intelligence officers were told not to overestimate the enemy. Analysts who argued that American mobilization was surpassing expectations were accused of defeatism. Operational planning continued to rely on assumptions that had already been proven wrong. By the end of 1942, the pattern was unmistakable. Every battle revealed not just tactical differences, but a fundamental misreading of scale. Japan's intelligence apparatus had measured the enemy's methods, but not his means. They understood how the Americans fought, but not how deeply they could draw upon the power to keep fighting, no matter how many ships or men were lost. American ground forces received continuous resupply from transport vessels crewed by merchant mariners who had been recruited, trained and deployed in a matter of months rather than years. Japanese submarines patrolling the sea lanes to Guadalcanal watched convoy after convoy steaming through the South Pacific. They reported traffic levels that seemed impossible for a Navy Tokyo still believed had fewer than 400,000 total personnel. The picture defied logic. The Americans were sustaining a major offensive campaign in the Solomon Islands, while simultaneously maintaining Atlantic convoy operations against Germany, conducting large-scale training and fleet exercises at home, and manning construction crews for the endless procession of new vessels leaving U.S. shipyards. The math did not work. Either Japanese intelligence estimates were catastrophically wrong, or the Americans had somehow found a way to multiply their available manpower beyond any plausible calculation. Tokyo chose the explanation that required no change in policy. They convinced themselves that the Americans were overextended and would soon reach a breaking point. Japanese analysts watched, calculated, and waited for that collapse. It never came. By early 1943, reports from the field were growing urgent. Commanders in the Solomons and Central Pacific were sending increasingly desperate cables describing an enemy who seemed to have no limits. American ships replaced losses within weeks. New air groups appeared faster than they could be destroyed. Supply convoys arrived in volume undiminished by submarine attacks. The operational tempo was accelerating, not slowing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, finally intervened. a Harvard-educated officer who had served as naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. Yamamoto understood the United States in a way few of his contemporaries did. He knew its population, its industry, its energy. When he reviewed the reports from Guadalcanal and the South Pacific, he saw what they implied. American naval forces in the Pacific had already grown beyond pre-war intelligence projections. In a blunt and undiplomatic cable to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, Yamamoto demanded an explanation. Either, he wrote, the Americans had stripped the Atlantic bare, an unlikely prospect given the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, or Japan's intelligence estimates were fundamentally flawed. We are fighting an enemy who grows stronger with every engagement, he warned. Our assumptions regarding his limitations must be re-examined before they destroy us. Tokyo's reply was cautious and bureaucratic. A review would be conducted. Updated intelligence assessments would be compiled in due course, but no meaningful adjustments were made. The same manpower figures continued to appear in planning documents well into 1943. The machinery of assumption ground on, even as the war's reality rendered those assumptions obsolete. Yamamoto knew what that meant. The empire was fighting the wrong kind of war against the wrong kind of enemy. And by the time Tokyo understood that, the outcome would already be beyond recall. The situation could not continue. Field commanders were fighting based on assumptions that no longer matched observed reality. Tokyo needed answers. The task fell to a small group of officers in the Naval Intelligence Division who specialized in American naval analysis. They began by collecting every fragment of data accumulated over the past 18 months: submarine patrol reports, reconnaissance sightings, radio intercepts, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations. Every piece of evidence that could yield a number was extracted, cross-checked, and entered into new tables. They counted ships. Every aircraft carrier, battleship, cruiser, destroyer, and transport reported in the Pacific. They assigned minimum crew complements based on known vessel types and mission requirements. Then they did the same for the Atlantic. Convoy escorts plying the routes to Britain, carrier groups supporting the North African landings, and training commands operating from both American coasts. Shore stations, repair bases, and logistics hubs were added next. When they totaled the numbers, the result was shocking. Even using the most conservative assumptions, American naval and auxiliary personnel exceeded 850,000. That was already more than double the figure on which all Japanese war planning had been based. But the officers were not finished. They applied the manning standards documented in captured U.S. operations manuals, standards that allocated more personnel per ship, per department, per function than Japanese doctrine had ever allowed. When these ratios were applied to the observed ship counts, the total rose to 1,200,000, and that was only the beginning. Those numbers represented active operational forces alone. They did not include the immense training pipeline of recruits in boot camps, technical schools turning out specialists, or advanced training units preparing for deployment. Nor did they count the vast American shore establishment of maintenance depots, communications networks, and administrative commands required to sustain global operations. The intelligence officers compiled their findings into a formal report. Its conclusion was unambiguous. Japanese estimates of American naval manpower were not merely inaccurate. They were wrong by a factor of at least 3-1, possibly 4-1, and could rise even higher as wartime mobilization continued. It was a verdict as clear as it was terrifying. The United States was not straining to maintain the war. It was accelerating. The reports reached senior leadership in the spring of 1943. They were read, questioned, and fiercely debated. The conclusions seemed impossible to officers who had spent their entire careers in a navy that expanded slowly and deliberately. One ship, one crew, one carefully trained sailor at a time. To them, mobilization had natural limits. Training required years. Experience could not be compressed. Cohesion grew only through prolonged service together. Every assumption of Japanese naval culture rested on these truths. The notion that a nation could train hundreds of thousands of sailors in a matter of months violated not just doctrine, but imagination itself. The analysts' numbers were not dismissed outright, but they were explained away. Perhaps the Americans were inflating their rosters. Perhaps they counted civilian laborers or auxiliary personnel as naval strength. Perhaps they were simply inefficient. Every alternative seemed more plausible than the idea that the United States had achieved mass mobilization without sacrificing combat effectiveness. Then, in July 1943, confirmation arrived in the most unlikely form: a captured American sailor. He had been pulled from the sea after his destroyer was sunk off Kolombangara during a night surface engagement. He was young, sunburned, and shaken, but remarkably willing to talk. Japanese interrogators, accustomed to silence and evasion from their own captured men, were astonished by his openness. The cultural divide extended even into captivity. The sailor described his training at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Illinois. He had joined a company of 4,000 recruits. 4,000. More than the total complement of a Japanese carrier division. The facility, he said, processed 20,000 new sailors every month through 8-week courses before sending them to advanced schools or directly to the fleet. His words landed like ordnance in the quiet interrogation room. The numbers were too large to dismiss as exaggeration. They aligned with the intelligence reports already circulating in Tokyo. For the first time, the scale of American mobilization was not an abstraction. It had a face, a voice, and a story. In that moment, disbelief began to crack. What Japanese officers had taken for American inefficiency was revealed as something far more dangerous. An industrialized approach to training and warfighting that replaced tradition with throughput, efficiency with volume, and time with systems. The interrogation officer asked the sailor to repeat the number. Certain there had been a translation error. 20,000 per month? That meant 240,000 new sailors per year from a single training facility, raw recruits ready for technical schools. It did not include officer candidate schools producing ensigns and junior-grade lieutenants. It did not include specialized technical schools training radio men, gunners' mates, machinists' mates, and other ratings. Nor did it include advanced training facilities preparing flight crews, submarine crews, and specialized units. The sailor mentioned casually that he had friends training at 3 other major facilities around the country with similar capacity. If each facility processed comparable numbers, the Americans were adding close to 1 million new sailors per year to their personnel system. The interrogation report reached Tokyo in August 1943. Senior intelligence officers read it carefully. Supporting documentation accompanied the report, and yet, once again, the data were questioned rather than fully accepted. The prisoner was probably exaggerating to impress his captors. He was probably confused about what he had been told. Prisoners say things for many reasons. The information was noted as potentially significant, but because it could not be independently verified, it was deemed insufficiently reliable for planning purposes. The institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths remained formidable. Even when confronted with numbers that should have forced a strategic reckoning, Japanese officers defaulted to disbelief. The reports were filed, catalogued, and noted, but the assumptions underlying Japan's war plans remained unchanged. For intelligence officers who had compiled the calculations, cross-checked sightings, and documented mobilization figures, the frustration was crushing. They had evidence that the United States could, and would, replace losses faster than Japan could destroy them. Yet the Navy's culture and bureaucracy rendered that reality almost irrelevant. Proof alone was not enough to alter the course of a war already being fought on false assumptions. Verification arrived from an unexpected and indisputable source. In September 1943, a German submarine operating in the Atlantic transmitted a detailed report to Berlin describing convoy escort operations observed during a multi-day patrol. The report included technical observations of American destroyer escorts, their tactical performance, crew organization, and manning levels. Through routine intelligence exchange, German naval intelligence forwarded the report to their Japanese counterparts via the military attaché in Berlin. The German commander had counted personnel visible on deck during action stations, and estimated that each American destroyer escort carried between 180 and 200 sailors. Comparable Japanese destroyer escorts of similar size operated with crews of only 100 to 120. The vessels were not significantly larger, they were simply more heavily manned. The Germans noted the anomaly as an operational curiosity. For Japanese analysts, it was confirmation of a pattern they had long suspected but been unable or unwilling to accept. If American escorts carried 50% more personnel than Japanese equivalents, the same principle likely applied across the fleet. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and auxiliaries, all staffed at levels far exceeding Tokyo's assumptions. The implications were staggering. Every calculation about American fleet size, operational capacity, and sustainability rested on flawed manning estimates. The scale of U.S. naval capability, already obscured by cultural assumptions and bureaucratic inertia, was now indisputably revealed through independent, Allied observation. For the intelligence officers who had spent months compiling and analyzing reports, the German confirmation was both vindication and dread. The data they had struggled to communicate for years were now beyond reasonable dispute. Yet they also understood that confirmation alone would not change strategic planning unless senior leadership chose to act, and Japan's wartime bureaucracy was as slow to act as it had been stubborn in belief. September 1943 marked the first time Tokyo quietly acknowledged a fundamental problem in its understanding of American capabilities. A working group was formed within the Naval Intelligence Division, specifically to reassess U.S. personnel strength using all available information, without concern for whether the conclusions fit pre-existing assumptions. The group included experienced intelligence officers and operations planners who understood how manpower translated directly into operational capability. They were granted access to classified files from multiple sources and instructed to develop new estimates based on comprehensive analysis, not incremental adjustments to outdated numbers. For 6 weeks, the team examined every piece of evidence systematically: ship sightings, radio intercepts, interrogation reports, captured documents, industrial output, and observed expansion rates at training facilities. When the report was submitted on November 9, 1943, it estimated American naval personnel strength at approximately 1,800,000 as of mid-1943, with projected growth to 2,400,000 by mid-1944. Even these numbers were conservative. The working group had deliberately hedged their estimates, reluctant to present figures that might appear extreme, despite evidence suggesting higher totals. The report included a detailed appendix explaining the strategic consequences of the revised figures. With nearly 2 million sailors in service and continued expansion, the Americans could simultaneously maintain multiple major fleet concentrations across different theaters without sharing resources. They could launch unrestricted offensive operations in the Pacific, while sustaining full-strength convoy escort operations in the Atlantic. The gap between Japanese expectations and American reality was no longer abstract. It was quantifiable, undeniable, and strategically catastrophic. They could sustain combat losses at rates Japan could never match, and still expand total force strength. They could maintain extensive logistics networks, moving supplies across vast ocean distances. They could garrison island bases with permanent personnel rather than rotating limited forces. Every assumption that had guided Japanese strategy for the past 2 years was invalidated by these numbers. The defensive perimeter strategy, premised on limited American forces unable to strike multiple points simultaneously, was obsolete. The quick war scenario, reliant on American war weariness and willingness to negotiate, was impossible. The Americans were not running out of manpower. They would never reach a breaking point where losses exceeded their ability to replace them. They would continue building ships, training crews, and sending them west, until Japan was crushed under the sheer weight of numerical superiority. The working group's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Japan had entered a war against an opponent whose mobilization potential was an order of magnitude greater than intelligence estimates had predicted. The error was not correctable through operational adjustments or tactical innovation. Superior Japanese training, superior fighting spirit, and superior tactics could not overcome a 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage in personnel. The mathematics were absolute and immutable. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. The only remaining questions were how long it could sustain the fight before inevitable collapse, and whether any negotiated settlement could be reached before that collapse became complete. The report reached the highest levels of naval leadership. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, serving as Navy Minister, received a copy. Senior officers on the Naval General Staff read it carefully. The numbers could not be disputed. The analysis was sound. The methodology was rigorous, and the conclusions were logically derived from verified observations. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet the officers could not share the report widely. To do so would have triggered an institutional crisis. If field commanders realized the war was mathematically unwinnable based on personnel ratios alone, morale would collapse. Combat effectiveness depends in part on the belief in possible victory. If the government recognized that naval intelligence had miscalculated on a fundamental level, there would be demands for accountability, and possibly leadership changes, at the worst possible moment, in the middle of a losing war. If the emperor learned that the conflict had been initiated based on intelligence estimates off by a factor of 8-to-1, the entire military leadership could be held responsible for a strategic disaster of unprecedented magnitude. The political implications were intolerable. The report was classified at the highest security level. Distribution was limited to fewer than 20 officers with a direct operational need to know. The information was contained and controlled. Official estimates were quietly updated in internal planning documents for resource allocation and operational planning. No public announcement was made. No formal strategic reassessment was issued. Any revision that might require explaining why fundamental assumptions had changed was deliberately avoided. In effect, the truth existed only on paper. It informed planning, but it did not alter strategy. Japan was now committed to a course dictated not by reality, but by the necessity of maintaining morale and protecting institutional credibility. The mathematics of American mobilization were undeniable, yet the full implications would remain unspoken, an invisible weight shaping the war from behind closed doors. The war continued as if nothing had changed, even though everything had changed. Field commanders remained unaware of the revised estimates. They planned operations based on assumptions that the Americans were overextended and nearing the limits of their manpower. Those assumptions were wrong. They had always been wrong, and now people at the top knew it. But the machinery of war was in motion, and it could not be stopped without admitting catastrophic institutional failure. By December 1943, actual American naval strength was 2,374,094. Japanese planners had estimated 296,000. The miscalculation was 7.8 to 1. This was not a failure of intelligence collection. Japanese officers had access to most of the necessary information through multiple channels. Prisoner interrogations provided first-hand accounts of training and personnel systems. Radio intercepts revealed unit structures and designations. Ship sighting reports documented deployments in multiple theaters. Technical publications detailed training facilities and manning policies. The information had been available throughout the war. The failure was analytical, not empirical. Japanese intelligence officers simply could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America did. They looked at the raw data, but interpreted it through their own cultural and organizational lens. They saw an American Navy operating like the Imperial Japanese Navy, because that was the only model they understood. Every data point was filtered through assumptions about how navies functioned, how personnel were trained, how units were organized, and how mobilization proceeded. Those assumptions were drawn entirely from Japanese experience and Japanese practices. In effect, the truth existed, but the framework through which it was viewed made it invisible. They were completely wrong when applied to America. Japanese intelligence officers were prisoners of their own assumptions, unable to see beyond their cultural blinders, even as accumulating evidence repeatedly contradicted them. The consequences played out over the next 2 years with brutal inevitability. In 1944, the United States launched simultaneous major operations across multiple theaters. The Central Pacific Offensive pushed through the Marshall Islands and the Marianas toward the Philippines. The Southwest Pacific Campaign advanced along New Guinea toward the Dutch East Indies. Operations in China, Burma, and India supported Chinese resistance and prepared for eventual operations against the Asian mainland. Meanwhile, full-strength U.S. naval forces remained committed to the Atlantic, escorting convoys, supporting amphibious operations in Europe, and maintaining pressure on German naval forces. Japanese commanders faced American task forces that seemed to multiply regardless of losses. Destroy one carrier group and 2 more appeared within weeks. Sink a dozen destroyers and 20 more joined the fleet the following month. The Americans absorbed losses that would have crippled Japan and emerged stronger every time. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan committed its remaining carrier forces to what was intended as a decisive engagement to blunt American offensive capability. The Americans deployed a task force of 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The personnel operating that single formation numbered approximately $70,000. To put that in perspective, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy at the start of the war in December 1941 had fewer than 400,000 personnel, including all branches, shore establishments, training commands, and administrative staff. The Americans were fielding individual task forces with manning levels that represented significant portions of Japan's entire naval strength, while simultaneously operating multiple comparable task forces in other theaters. Japan had misjudged not just the size of the U.S. Navy, but the scale of the industrial and human resources behind it. Their assumptions, their mirror-imaged calculations, and their cultural lens had produced a fatal underestimation. And by the time the reality became undeniable in battle after battle, the numerical and logistical gap was irrecoverable. The scale of American mobilization had become visible in ways that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Japanese losses at the Philippine Sea included 3 carriers and approximately 450 aircraft, along with their pilots and aircrew. Catastrophic by any measure. The Americans lost 29 aircraft. Their carriers were back in full operation within hours. having replaced losses and resumed normal flight operations without any reduction in capability. The battle demonstrated in brutal clarity what unlimited personnel availability meant in practical terms. The Americans could absorb losses that would have crippled any other navy, maintain operations without pause, and press attacks continuously because they had depth throughout their organization. They had trained personnel ready to replace casualties immediately, training pipelines producing thousands of new sailors each month, and shore establishments large enough to support sustained operations indefinitely. Japan had none of those advantages. Every loss was permanent and irreplaceable. Every pilot killed represented years of training lost forever. Every ship sunk removed capability that could never be recovered, given Japan's limited industrial capacity and personnel base. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with greater resources, and the Americans had resources Japan could not match, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical skill. For the Japanese officers who understood the truth, the realization was excruciating. The war had been lost before it even started, not because of tactical mistakes that could have been corrected, nor strategic errors that might have been avoided with better planning, but because of an intelligence failure so fundamental that it rendered victory mathematically impossible, no matter how well Japan fought. If Japanese planners had known in 1941 that America would deploy over 2 million sailors in the Pacific theater alone by 1944, the entire strategic calculus would have been different. The assumptions, the plans, the campaigns, they were all built on a foundation of profound misperception, and the consequences would unfold with inexorable, tragic clarity. The argument that America lacked the will to fight a prolonged war becomes meaningless when the United States has the capacity to fight 3 major wars simultaneously in different hemispheres without straining its mobilization potential. The hope that Japan could seize territory and defend it successfully collapses when the enemy can generate replacement forces faster than Japan can inflict losses through combat attrition. The entire premise of Japanese strategy, achieving early victories to establish a defensive perimeter, and then forcing America to accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight a costly war of attrition, was based on assumptions about American limitations that were fundamentally incorrect from the outset. Some historians argue that even with accurate intelligence about American mobilization, Japan would have gone to war anyway. The oil embargo imposed by the United States left Japan facing economic strangulation that would have crippled its military and industrial capacity within months. The resource needs of the empire, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Southeast Asia, demanded military action. A military culture prioritizing honor and national prestige over pragmatic calculation further pushed Japan toward conflict. These arguments have merit, but they miss a crucial point. Wars are ultimately fought by people who believe victory is possible. Accurate intelligence about American strength might not have prevented the war's outbreak under the pressures Japan faced, but it could have fundamentally changed how Japan fought once the war began. Knowledge of the true scale of American mobilization would have exposed the futility of attritional campaigns, forced a rethinking of operational priorities, and perhaps saved lives and material by highlighting the strategic limits of Japan's position. With realistic estimates showing a 10-to-1 American personnel advantage, Japanese planning might have focused on limited objectives rather than expansive territorial conquest. Defensive strategies could have been prioritized over ambitious offensive operations aimed at achieving decisive victory. Earlier attempts at negotiation might have been pursued more seriously before the strategic situation became completely hopeless. The war that actually unfolded, with total commitment to offensive operations across the Pacific and a categorical rejection of compromise, until final defeat, was only possible because Japanese leaders at all levels believed they were fighting an enemy with limited resources, who would eventually tire of the conflict. That belief was wrong from the beginning, and the intelligence failure that created and sustained it cost Japan everything it sought to defend. Commander Chikataka Nakajima served with the 2nd Fleet and Combined Fleet from December 1941 until August 1945. His duties included assembling intelligence from multiple sources, preparing estimates of enemy capabilities and intentions, and analyzing naval operations to extract lessons for future planning. After the war, Nakajima was interviewed extensively by American naval intelligence officers documenting Japanese intelligence capabilities and assessing how Japan had evaluated American strength throughout the conflict. The Americans asked him directly about the failures in estimating American manpower mobilization, and why Japanese calculations had been so catastrophically wrong. Nakajima's explanation was candid and revealing. He described Japanese naval intelligence as organizationally weak throughout the pre-war period and during the war itself, chronically understaffed relative to its mission requirements. Japanese naval intelligence was institutionally marginalized within the Navy's hierarchy. Intelligence assignments carried lower prestige and offered fewer opportunities for promotion than combat or command billets. Officers who raised concerns about American capabilities, particularly warnings that suggested Japan was overmatched, were often dismissed or ignored by operations. Officers already committed to specific courses of action. The organizational system was not designed to challenge fundamental assumptions or question strategic premises established by senior leadership. It existed to support decisions that had already been made, providing confirming information and tactical details. When intelligence assessments contradicted operational plans or suggested that strategic assumptions might be wrong, the intelligence was questioned rather than the plans. The institutional culture throughout the Japanese Navy made catastrophic miscalculation not only possible, but nearly inevitable. Accurate assessment requires the ability to accept uncomfortable truths. The Japanese system was not built to accept such truths when they conflicted with institutional preferences or pre-existing strategic commitments. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada served as Navy Minister from October 18, 1941 to July 17, 1944, encompassing the entire first phase of the Pacific War. He also briefly served concurrently as Chief of the Naval General Staff from February 21 to August 2, 1944, holding both positions for approximately 5 critical months. After Japan's surrender, Shimada was arrested and tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East as a Class A war criminal. The charges included waging aggressive war, violating international law, and crimes against peace. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life imprisonment, serving 11 years in Sugamo prison before being paroled in 1955 due to declining health. He died in 1976 at the age of 92, one of the last surviving senior admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Throughout his remaining years, Shimada never publicly acknowledged the intelligence reports that had warned of American manpower superiority years before the war's end. In his testimony at trial and in later statements, he maintained that Japan had fought with honor and determination against overwhelming odds that could not have been foreseen. In one sense, this was true. Japan did fight with honor and determination, but it was also fundamentally incomplete. Japan fought bravely against odds that its own intelligence services had catastrophically underestimated in the pre-war period. Odds that senior leadership, including Shimada himself, failed to adequately address or respond to once the reality became apparent during the war. The institutional failure extended beyond the initial miscalculation, to include a failure to adapt when evidence contradicted assumptions. The final accounting was brutal in its simplicity and mathematical certainty. Japan began the war with approximately 120,000 naval personnel. This included the professional officer corps, the enlisted sailors serving on ships and at shore stations, and the administrative and support personnel required to maintain the service. The nation expanded its naval force to approximately 300,000 by 1945 through sustained mobilization efforts. Total mobilization over 4 years of total war produced a 3-fold increase in personnel. By any historical standard, this was an impressive expansion for a nation of Japan's size and industrial capacity. Impressive by any standard, except the one that mattered in the context of the Pacific War. The United States began the war with approximately 337,000 naval personnel in December 1941. By the war's end in August 1945, that force had grown to over 3,380,000, a 10-fold increase achieved in less than 4 years. The Americans trained and deployed more sailors in 1944 alone than Japan had in its entire navy at peak wartime strength. They operated more ships than Japan could build, flew more aircraft than Japan could manufacture, moved more supplies across greater distances than Japan could transport, and sustained forces simultaneously in more places than Japanese planners had thought possible for any nation. The intelligence estimate that projected 296,000 American sailors by December 1943 missed the actual number of 2,374,094 by a factor of nearly 8 to 1. This was not a small error, a rounding mistake, or a miscalculation based on incomplete information. It was a fundamental failure to understand the nature of the enemy Japan was fighting. That failure determined the outcome of the war before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor, before the first American ship was sunk, and before the first battle was fought. The numbers made victory impossible, regardless of tactical skill, strategic brilliance, or fighting spirit. Intelligence working groups produced comprehensive reassessments in late 1943, demonstrating that American strength far exceeded anything Japanese planning had assumed. Yet by then, it was too late to adjust strategy, too late to avoid the consequences of a misjudgment that had already set the war on an irreversible course. The officers who compiled these reports, working with all available information and applying rigorous analytical methods, understood exactly what the numbers meant for Japan's strategic position. The war was lost. The mathematics were absolute. No amount of tactical success could overcome such a fundamental numerical disadvantage. But the system was not designed to act on uncomfortable truths that undermined the very basis for continuing the war. Institutional incentives pointed toward suppressing such information rather than acting on it. The reports were classified at the highest security levels, distributed only to the smallest possible group with an operational need to know. Operational planning continued, based on outdated assumptions, because changing those assumptions would have required admitting that the entire strategic foundation of the war had been built on false premises from the beginning. Intelligence is not just about gathering information from enemy territory or hostile sources. It is also about analyzing that information to extract meaningful patterns and predictions. And sometimes, perhaps most importantly, it is about discovering uncomfortable truths that nobody wants to hear and nobody wants to accept. The tragedy of Japanese naval intelligence in World War II was not that they eventually discovered the truth about American strength. They did. The tragedy was that when they finally understood it, the institutional and political structures governing decision-making prevented that truth from changing the course of the war or even significantly influencing operational planning. The truth was discovered, documented, and then buried, because acting on it would have required acknowledging failures that the system could not admit. Wars are lost through fundamental miscalculations about who you are, fighting, and the resources they can bring to bear. In 1941, Japan began a conflict under false assumptions. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was too late to change the outcome. The Japanese looked at America and saw a nation that would mobilize the way Japan mobilized, slowly, carefully, with an emphasis on quality over quantity. They estimated manpower requirements using Japanese models and assumptions about training time and personnel development. They prepared to fight a war against an enemy that existed primarily in their own imagination, an enemy that matched their preconceptions about how modern industrial nations conducted warfare. The real enemy, the one that actually existed rather than the one they imagined, operated on a completely different scale, with completely different assumptions about what was possible. The real enemy had unlimited manpower reserves and the organizational capacity to turn civilians into sailors in months rather than years. The real enemy could sustain losses that would have destroyed Japan and still expand total force strength. The real enemy could fight multiple major wars simultaneously in different hemispheres without having to choose between them. That enemy destroyed Japan not because American sailors were individually superior, or American ships better designed, though both were often true, but because there were simply so many more of them. The scale of the force, the depth of the organization, and the capacity for sustained mobilization made the conflict mathematically unwinnable from the outset. So many more that Japanese intelligence could not imagine the numbers, even when evidence had accumulated that should have made the truth obvious. 296,000 estimated. 2,330 actual. That gap, between assumption and reality, between what Japan thought it was fighting and what it actually faced, tells the complete story of how one catastrophic intelligence failure determined the outcome of the Pacific War before the war truly began. The numbers were always there in American technical publications, census data, and industrial statistics. The data was available to anyone who wanted to see it. What was missing was the ability to see beyond cultural assumptions and organizational limitations, to understand an enemy that operated on a completely different scale, with completely different rules. That blindness, that inability to see what should have been obvious, cost Japan everything it fought to preserve. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.